our attitudes and our behaviors and how we treat each other in family dynamics. And I notice a very big difference. There's a lot of similarities between your upbringings, but also a lot of differences. The way that there could be, the way I found the Rosenbaum house could be, seems very highly conducive to self-isolation. It's humble and natural, but it's also very easy to have a very big distance. It seemed like in that family, and that seemed to be born out of the nature of the house itself. Whereas Mernaz, in the house you grew up in, it was sort of imposed by the family and being forbidden to touch things in certain rooms, and the sort of museum-like obsession with cleanliness. And I was wondering if you'd comment on to what degree different types of architecture and different types of houses inform our behavior and our attitudes, or if they're being imposed by the people in the dwelling.
I can only talk about my experience with our house in Tehran, which was, I really never felt comfortable in the house, because all around, just like their house, was all windows. So I felt that I was visible by everybody who could see me. Didn't have a sense of privacy that much, and also because of these large windows, Tehran is a very sunny sort of place, and it would get so hot. So maybe it wasn't appropriate. So I always thought, who thought that this modern house would be appropriate? I would prefer those older buildings that had different kind of windows and doors. But also I've always thought why the best part of the house had to be for the guests. We should not enter there, not touch it. It was always the most beautiful part of the living room was the guest room, and we were not allowed to use the best. So when I came to this country, I said, wow, that's good, you use your living room, and that's great. You don't put it for, but the idea of appearance and guests for us was very important, and that's one of the link between connection between his mother of 1950s and of course my mother in 1970s, to be so obsessed with the appearance.
I have a question for both of you actually. So this isn't like entirely my work as people and architecture. I'm a psychologist, and this movie is really fascinating to me because it's very clear, Jonathan, the grief and the burden in some ways that this house caused you and your family, and Mernaz for you as well, but at the same time it's not passing judgment in one way or the other, and it's really interesting because Frank Lloyd Wright is so well known for these houses that are incredibly problematic for the people who live in them and that exert all this control, and yet that's what's selected and presented as an example of architecture and beautiful residential architecture, and you've both wound up in work that is about selecting and presenting stories to people and these particular faces we choose to show. And I'm really curious now in this era in which we select and present almost everything about ourselves in different ways through different channels, if there's something that we can learn from how we make those choices and acknowledge the good and the bad side of that, from lessons learned from living in this house, from making films about this house, and choosing which part of the story to show to acknowledge both sides. It was just a very beautiful film.
Thank you. I was so nervous to show the film to the director of the museum because she gave me, of course he helped to get permission, but she was anxious. She said, give me that film to see, what you've done. I hope you haven't said anything negative about Frank Lloyd Wright. But I said, no, it's a different kind of film and all that, but, yeah.
One idea that I actually came up with at the earlier screening of this film, which I still feel is that in a strange sort of way, this film begins as a very conventional documentary, but I think it winds up being like a fiction film in a lot of ways. And the reason why is because when the whole importance of it being a museum becomes more and more important, when people are visiting the house, they're projecting their own fictions into it. I think, and in a sense, it becomes an imaginary space for their own lives or lives that they imagine and so on. And of course, the whole idea of the whole idea of ghosts being there and so on. It seems to me grows out of that fictional idea because it's there's the fiction of keeping all these things in the closets, of the beds being made, of the table being set when there's no family living there. So there's something very disturbing about that. And it's disturbing. It was disturbing about it because when we were filming it at night, it was like there were no tourists there. It's also interesting. One thing, seeing the film many times now, I've become more and more aware of how much it's all fiction. Because I mean, for example, the first time when my brother Alvin comes back, and the car is approaching the house, and we hear Alvin's voiceover as if he were in the car talking about the house. But in fact, he wasn't. It was like I was driving the car and Renaz was filming. But because of his voiceover, we imaginally project my brother inside the car. And it's like documentary is constantly doing things like this. I mean, when we look at Nanook of the North, how many people know that the woman who's called Nanook's wife is actually not his wife, but was Robert Flaherty's mistress, for example? And it seems to me that in order to tell a coherent story, you have to turn it into fiction on some level. And so it seems to me that that's a thing that I think that this film is trying, in some ways, confronting because of the strange kind of mixture. And of course, the filmmaker that we wrote a book together about, Kurostami, he's a perfect example of someone who interfaces fiction and nonfiction in very mysterious ways. And he even said, for him, the difference between documentary and fiction is much less important than the difference between a good film and a bad film. Which I think is true. Which I think is true, actually.
When I was filming The Tourist, Jonathan, in one instance, he was there actually, and the guide was telling explaining the house and everything. And so some of the tourists had some question about the Rosenbaum family, and at that point, Jonathan cut in and sort of started to help the guide and say something. But the tourists were not interested in what he has to say. They were only interested in what the guy had to say.
I think one thing I think is kind of funny too, that may not be apparent to you when you're watching the film, is that one of the tourists that you see, with part of the crowd is Murnaz, actually. That she's one of the tourists at one of the points in terms of being filmed. So one of the reasons we were able to get, by the way, all of those smooth tracking shots is we borrowed a wheelchair that I could wheel Murnaz around in. So that's kind of how, and in a way it was a great realization for me because I'd always fantasized when I was growing up wanting to make a film about the house. And I thought about it in relation to favorite films like Last Year at Marienbad and things like this. And so that's why I thought it would be great to have, moving camera shots going down the hall and all of this. So in some ways it was able to kind of realize that dream.
Yeah, I love the film there. It really packed a great deal of material into a very small space of time. Very kind of respectful for the audience's time on that. You mentioned about your time in Iran, about all the windows everywhere. There's a novel, I think it was We, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, which all houses must be all glass, so everyone can surveil everyone at all times, which seems kind of dystopian there. And I really like the conflict there, the contrast between your acceptance of everybody's subjectivity versus Frank Lloyd Wright's, hyper authoritarianism over everybody, like squeezed through the door, and all that's a huge conflict there. And I did want to ask you about, you mentioned about your parents' home being stolen in Iran. Was there some complex legal machination? Or is this somebody just kind of armed robbery by bulldozer and the cops just said, yeah, we don't care?
It was a combination. It's a very complicated story, but because my mother, she came here for a visit, but because there was a war, 8-year Iran-Iraq war, we kept her here, and so the house, some people took over the house, and they would not let the house out, and they were, I don't know who they were connected to, but they took over the house, and later, I don't know, they ruined the house and bulldozed the house, and something else was built in our absence, so I don't know.
I've heard stories about people staying behind in war zones in Iraq because, well, somebody will take the house if somebody doesn't live here.
Well,
Yeah, it's kinda
after the
crazy thing.
revolution, if the owner of the house especially went to United States or Europe
Mm.
for a long time, and you didn't have somebody taking care of your property,
But did she lose all the contents of the house too? Or
yeah,
wow, that's
everything, yeah.
that's incredible.
So I don't know how much more we have, maybe we are at the end of the, yes? Yes, okay, thank you so much, you have been an excellent audience, thank you.